Right, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for this Centre of Excellence Roundtable. I'm delighted to invite a great panel to talk about the Centre of Excellence maturity curve. So we've got some panelists here who've got a range of experience from having established Centre of Excellences and also at the point where they've had to start one and then introduce it. So this topic has been one that has been requested by a number of people from previous panel sessions. Everyone's been talking about a Centre of Excellence, but a number of people have said, how do we get started? So this panel will, I'm sure, be able to come up with the answers, having been through that cycle multiple times. But before I introduce the panel, I'd just like to set the scene in terms of what a Centre of Excellence is, because I think there are so many different definitions. Probably we've got at least 4 definitions from the different people on the panel and everybody who's listening. So a Centre of Excellence is actually not about a set of skills, it's a set of roles, it's actually about a set of skills. People look at those 13 different pillars and say, well, I haven't got 13 people on the team. How on earth can I put a Centre of Excellence together when we're fairly small? And I think people spend their time focusing on the word centre rather than the word excellence. So if I think about those 13 pillars, not all of them are product. A lot of them are about the way you organise yourself. So the first is vision. What is the vision for your implementation of Salesforce? What are you trying to achieve with it? The second is leadership. Do you have senior management support? Do you have the buy-in from the leadership team? The next pillar there is about governance, which is how are you defining the changes that you want to make? How are you signing those off? Do you have some form of panel that signs off changes? Then the next point there is change control. So what is the mechanism you're going to drive those changes through? So you've got some rigor, so you know that, that those changes are being implemented correctly. Which leads to the next point, which is what's your overall implementation methodology? Is it waterfall? Is it agile? Is it a mixture of the two? Do you have a clearly defined methodology that goes all the way from defining requirements through to delivered software? The next is standards, and people think, oh, that's about coding standards or testing standards, but it's way broader than that. It's all about your documentation standards. How do you capture requirements? What are your standards around process mapping? What are your standards for documentation? So it's broader than just the coding standards. The next is a big item, metadata management. With low code, no code applications like Salesforce, we can very quickly configure Salesforce, but we need to keep control of that configuration. We often find that the level of technical debt rises very quickly, and it's very difficult to manage if you have no way of understanding what's been configured. Which leads to the next point, which is architecture. If you've decided to go and build a house, you build a one-story house, and then 5 years later realize you want 2 more floors, it becomes particularly difficult to go and build it. So getting that architecture done, defined up front, based on the knowledge of where you're trying to take the business back to the vision, is really critical. And you'll see Salesforce doubling down in terms of architecture, in terms of more certifications and a real focus on architecture. The next one is security. Security, again, way easier if it's baked into the design at the beginning rather than trying to add it as a bolt-on at the end. And again, with increasing numbers of hacks into systems, then this is becoming a center of attention for many organizations. Change management is not about necessarily changing the software, but it's actually about changing the people. It's about how do you drive user adoption? How are you going to define the training, or if there's a big change in terms of the way they work, how are you going to get that change, both in terms of organization, in terms of business process, but in terms of working practices. The next pillar there, PMO, the Program Management Office. How are you organizing the project? How are you tracking costs? How are you tracking the return on investment? Last one there on tooling. Tooling is all about, okay, what are you going to be using for capturing requirements? What are you going to be using for your metadata management? What are you using for DevOps? What are you using for training? So there's a set of tools that don't necessarily come with Salesforce that you may need to look outside to go and purchase. And again, you need to make a decision based on what you currently have, what your requirements are, and then what you need to grow to in the future. And the last one on the bottom there is prototyping. Some organizations who are starting to be very innovative in terms of how they use Salesforce, the center of excellence is often the place where that prototyping is done, so that innovation can then be shared across the business. So as I said, this is skills, not roles. The good news for anyone who's looking at this is going, we can't possibly do all of this. It's phased. When you're smaller, you don't necessarily need all of these in place from day one. And I think the last point there is these are solved problems. We're not making these up from first principles. A number of the panel here have been around the Salesforce ecosystem for 5, 10, 15, in my case, 20 years. And these are problems that we've seen solved in other ecosystems. And a report by 10K Advisors showed that there is an extremely high return on investment if you have a center of excellence in place. 91% of the organizations they surveyed who had a very high ROI had a center of excellence. So there is a business case for doing this. And I'm sure we'll find when we start to talk to the panel, how they are building their business case so they can get their leadership team to buy into putting these things in place. Which leads to the last question, which is, wow, do I have to do all of this on day one? And the answer is no. So if you look at this chart here, if you're a small organization, that doesn't necessarily mean by the number of users, but it might actually just be about the level of complexity of your org. You could be a small wealth management, small wealth bank, but with high regulation. Therefore, you'd be considered, you'd need a lot of the complexity on the right-hand side. You could be a large organization that is relatively simple, and actually you don't need all those pillars in place. So you can see there, the white dot says doesn't need to be in place necessarily if you're small. Orange says, yes, you need it, you should be thinking about it. Red says you definitely need to have it in place. So you've heard more than enough of me. That's set the scene. Let's actually have a discussion with the panel. Some quick introductions. On the left there, Roger Pelham. Roger's just joined us from a trustees meeting where he's been getting sign off for a centre of excellence. So we'll probably be hearing about that. But that's interesting. Roger's at the point of just creating a centre of excellence for Excelsior College. But 9 years ago, he was at GE, where he implemented the first Salesforce implementation and started a centre of excellence there. So we've got the juxtaposition of having implemented one and then actually now starting to implement a new one. Todd Stelter is joining us from International Hotels Group. He spent the last 10 years there and he's now director of the Centre of Excellence there. So again, experience of running a Centre of Excellence for a complex organization. OJ Malonzo is from All Cloud, but he spent 10 years in the ecosystem. He was the founder of Figure 8 Cloud Solutions, which was then acquired by All Cloud, and he's now the SVP for Strategic Accounts. And again, spends a lot of his time talking to customers about what they need to do to implement a Centre of Excellence. And then finally, John Eistedt. Similar story to Roger, actually. At PREM Group, he actually established a Centre of Excellence, then moved to Marcus Millichap, which is a real estate investment brokerage, large, complex organization, lots of politics, and is now trying to establish a Centre of Excellence. So I think, again, interesting juxtaposition there in terms of having established one, but now the challenges of getting one started. So OJ, you've obviously had years of experience of dealing with hundreds of customers. So is this Centre of Excellence a growing trend you see in the marketplace, or is it only for the large organizations?
Well, it's for every customer of all sizes. And as you can probably anticipate, it varies by customer. I've worked with organizations that even prior to rolling out Salesforce, they have an established team. They have a team that's ready to handle things like change management. They have a standard protocol for how they roll out change throughout the organization, as well as a methodology to what you had mentioned before, whether it's waterfall or agile. They even have experience rolling out software in general, and they know how to get business stakeholders, IT stakeholders aligned to agree on what's a priority to scale the organization. I've also worked with companies where they don't even have a basic release plan, how to capture feedback from the end user base, to build a backlog, prioritize what needs to get updated on a regular basis, and then work with the business on going to test and production. And some of the factors that I've seen that attribute to the level of COE maturity with customers I've worked with are, you mentioned earlier, customer size. How big are they in terms of the number of employees? How many licenses of Salesforce are they trying to roll out? Do they even have a PMO team, or at least individuals identified so that those folks can drive technical functions, testing, architecture integration, and on the business side, process training, adoption, change management. And sometimes the industry is a factor. Not to say that if they're not in tech, they're not sophisticated enough to establish a COE, but I've consulted with organizations that might not have experience rolling out software in general. And the idea of a COE and having to drive that change, it's new to them. And in the past, when I've worked with companies to establish one, a lot of it's education, understanding what's required to get, once Salesforce is live, that there's a governance model in place that will allow the organization to continue to drive change and help the company scale. And it's good to help set the expectation, right? What are the future enhancements, Salesforce? What's the cadence for communicating across the organization? How to minimize conflicts? So, I mean, I think overall, it's an important concept for companies that we have worked with in the past. And depending on the customer size, it's never too early or too late to set it up. It really just depends on getting the building blocks in place, getting all the IT stakeholders, the business stakeholders aligned, and having the organization make the investment to get it started.
I find that's fantastic. That's really set the scene, I think, for the rest of the discussion. So, Roger, you've seen both ends of it, from GE and now Excelsior. Can you contrast those? Is this a growing trend, or do you talk to me about what it's like at Excelsior compared with what it was like at GE?
If it's not a growing trend, it needs to be, right? And it doesn't just have to be Salesforce. There should be centers of excellence around large enterprise operations. If there's a tool supporting that, I feel those pillars are key, especially in this day and age of technology, where you have all business tie-in and business interests, and IT has to support that. So having that model, I think, is key to success. Being at GE, being a large conglomerate, when I was there originally, when we were the pilot and rolled out Salesforce, we were a small business unit of GE. We were very successful in doing so, and then GE implemented it out corporate-wide with the large conglomerate, worldwide in the different regions. And having a center of excellence was an easy concept. Business ownership, IT support, you had your vendors, your software vendors that you needed. Everyone had the requirements. They were coming in daily. How do you organize that? There was understanding behind that. There was Lean Six Sigma, right? There's black belt projects, green belt projects, right? How do we make our business more nimble, right? So driving to a COE at a large conglomerate was fairly easy. You didn't have to really sell it. The story was already there, because if we didn't have this model, it was going to go off the rails quickly. Contrast. Now at Excelsior, we have one org. We have a very small staff, very small college, user force, and getting the mindset of we need a center of excellence to move forward, to grow as we add on to Salesforce, as we move our native operations into Salesforce. We need to have control of that. So what we're looking at here is being a step ahead and creating a center of excellence. And going back to your model, Ian, we're going to be on that left column where there's a lot of dots not lit, only because we don't have the resources. So what we're looking at is how do we look at those functional areas on that list, and who do we plug into those areas and give them roles and responsibilities, get the leadership buy-in to allow them to have that empowerment to make those decisions, and then and grow the tool moving forward. But I feel that even being at Excelsior with one org, minimal staff, we have a board of trustees, we have the president's council, we have a council for this, a council for that, we have subcommittees for this, subcommittees for that. So now I'm going to introduce the center of excellence in the midst of all of that, and that's going to be my next challenge of how do we play well together and really incorporate the COE into our college operations.
So let me just summarize that. We said that GE already had some structures in place and therefore was fairly simple, or not simple, but actually they understood the concepts. Mm-hmm. Smaller college, actually more difficult to get implemented. So John, that feels like that's the reverse of the conversation that you and I had that said, small organization, easy to implement. You're now at a big organization and you're now getting through the struggles there.
It really was. At PREM Group, one of the advantages I had is the company president is the one who brought in Salesforce probably 5-6 years before I started. He was an early adopter around 2006, 2007. Mark Whalen was the sales rep at the time, who later became the vice president of North American sales, took over as the CEO of Pardot for a while. So that's how long he'd been on the product. And it'd been he and I really, and a developer. The entire time there was one developer and one admin building this out with his input as well, and kind of along his vision. And it came to a point where we really needed more input. My developer and I had built a completely new org for the company, totally shifting the paradigm and moving it more toward community based, and being able to provide all of it was a property management company, so providing residents, whether it's commercial or residential condominium, like all the information, everything they need, really easily. And we wanted to do more. We also had a maintenance division, so you have accounting. We want to be able to do some financial reporting things. So the Center of Excellence was really about bringing everybody from the different departments together, the key stakeholders for us, to make sure that everyone had an input, understanding what they wanted, what they needed, and really putting together the charter for what is Salesforce to us. What are we using this platform for? What do we want out of it? What is this team doing? That was kind of the first step for us of making everybody feel included and having a direction that we're going with it. And it really took off. And honestly, it was one of the things that made me feel more comfortable when I moved on to Marcus and Millichap, is now it wasn't just me with the knowledge and the plans and all that in my head, leaving everyone else behind. There was a team to support Salesforce for the company. Now moving to Marcus and Millichap, it's a large company, but unlike GE, we don't produce anything. So no one's used to things like, Six Sigma and all of that. Well, we do have a large development group, because Marcus and Millichap was founded with technology in mind. They, built a platform for tracking their deals nationally back in the, 80s and early 90s. So they were a technology-based company, but it was always on, really building on the Microsoft stack, building on SQL, and it was really one development team. The idea of Salesforce at this company, it was the afterthought. They literally had it just because they wanted to be able to offer agents and brokers a CRM tool that they didn't have to go pay for themselves. It was not a great implementation. No one really liked using it. Very siloed, because everyone wants their own data and doesn't want to share it. So you can imagine the number of duplicates that were in there. It just, there was no one understood what Salesforce could be for the company at the time. Over the last 2 years, Scott Edelstein, who was actually a broker who came over to the technology side and built out a Salesforce platform for his team in Manhattan, he was brought in by corporate, and between the two of us, we had a very similar vision. And we spent about a year kind of building a new org for our loan origination team and showing the company the power of the platform and what we could do with it, and how it could have an impact across the business. Customer 360 is something we're all hearing now, but people don't really understand it until you start putting it in front of them and showing what exactly that means. And we're at the point now where people are starting to see the power of it and have their own ideas. And what we're running into now is, without a Center of Excellence and just working with business sponsors, we have a business sponsor who's kind of trying to put his personal touch on things, changing more UI stuff. I want this look. And, to me, we have a project and the functionality is not there yet. And so we're spending time changing the, boldness of the tabs, changing how the lightning data tables are designed, colors and styling hooks, and like, we're not there yet. That's the sort of thing that kind of gets handled in a COE when you have a group of people working together to establish priorities, working from a charter, working from a shared vision. Then we're working toward what are we trying to accomplish here, and kind of keeps the personality out of it. But the other piece is, one of the things we have with all of our projects is the availability of business sponsors. There's a limited number of people who have kind of the seniority and the position where they can drive a project. But those people also have, are already busy. Their time is very expensive. And putting that together is kind of difficult. The first project I did, I had to, reschedule meetings, 2 months out sometimes because my project sponsor was too busy and wouldn't respond to things. And we're not having that same issue now, but a center of excellence kind of handles that. If somebody's missing, they're missing, but that's fine. That's just one voice in the room out of the 6, 7, 8 that you have for those meetings. And you have the, the larger monthly cadence or the monthly or every 2 month cadence with the full team. And then, either a 2 week or 1 week with the smaller team. And so it doesn't require everybody, but you have that planning and that vision. And it really helps to align the entire company behind what you're doing. And, it makes you much more comfortable with rollouts when everyone's looked at the training materials and said, yes, this looks good. Everybody knows the training plan and the rollout plan and says, yes, this looks good. And everybody's had kind of their voice on what's the next most important thing for the company. It really helps get the ROI because it's not just one person thinking this will really help. Everybody's agreeing, yes, from our shared experience and knowledge, this is what's going to drive ROI fastest.
Thank you, John. That's fantastic. So again, very different from Roger's experience. Todd, so you've had 10 years at Intercontinental hotel groups. Has it just been straight sailing, very easy, or talk us through the COE journey from your perspective?
Sure, yeah. So when I got involved, I had previously been a solution architect and then an enterprise architect. And the concept of a Salesforce Center of Excellence was created in our organization, in our technology organization. And at the time it was given, the concept of COE was given to another team who was supporting a couple of our Salesforce instances. We have 15 instances currently. At the time, we probably had 10-ish, maybe 12. It didn't go so well. I was looking, interesting to see your pillar slide there. I think then we were probably, a youth small on that scale of small, medium, large in the maturity model. It really had a couple of people, maybe 3 to 5. And it was, they weren't doing much other than having a community and providing some communications, newsletter and things like that. At the time, I had moved from enterprise architecture to running our largest of our Salesforce implementations, which was supporting our B2B sales group. And I had 8 people working for me in that role. And they decided that we would reorg and assign everybody with the under the quote unquote COE umbrella to me. And so my team became 11. And that's when I started the COE journey for real, what I would call it. We started then knocking off the things that were on your list of your pillar list there. And now I think we're probably, after almost 3 years, almost a large. We still don't do prototyping. We may not do 1 or 2 of the other items in your list. I know our PMO function within the COE is still very, very small, but we do have an intake process. Most of the other things that we have in place have happened in the last 3 years. So it's completely different than it was when we started this process in earnest. We now have a framework, a governance process, tooling we've added. We have, we grew from 11 to, before the pandemic, 85 resources, split shore staffing model. We've partnered with Exelsior for our technical resources, and really have put everything in place since then. All of our teams, we're back down now since the pandemic to about 40 to 45 resources, basically in a keep the lights on mode, waiting for more funding to start coming through as hospitality starts to pick back up. And yeah, but everything has changed. I mean, we started off, like I said, far left of your slide, probably small, and now we're somewhere close to large, with implementing consistent processes, tool sets, the governance process, our entire SDLC. Yeah, so quite a bit has changed for us. So
I guess this question is for all of you. I'll get a perspective, and is everyone would like to be where you all are. We've established it with Air, it's great. But I think the question I get asked a lot, which is, what do I have to do first?
Yeah, no, I think overall a good place to start is defining the general mission and goals for building a COE. Why is it important in the first place to have one? The other question could be, what type of investments are required to establish one across the organization? Really helps to set the expectation across the business on what's trying to get accomplished when you're managing Salesforce moving forward. And once you have alignment across the executive team, the business, IT, project teams, then it's identifying who those stakeholders are to drive it forward. So an executive sponsor, someone at the top that's going to champion the entire Salesforce program. And the steering committee, hey, what are the action items that need to be identified? How often are these project status calls? What's the intake process, and how do you review that backlog? And more importantly, prioritize it. Everybody across the end user base is going to want to have something implemented in Salesforce. And then when you have a technical director that's focused on integrations to Salesforce, testing cycles, you got the business director that's focused on change management, training, working with the business to figure out what kind of analytics or reporting is needed. Then figuring out how you get that feedback from all the different work streams across the business. And I think it's a really, it's an important point for balancing the right mixture of speed and flexibility with how quickly you want to innovate. And finding that balance is a really critical step. This was, in fact, an important concept for us when we were working with organizations to migrate their entire infrastructure into the cloud during the pandemic, right? A lot of companies that were just trying to keep up with digital transformation, they were either looking at, hey, do we cut costs on operations, or do we take this as an opportunity to invest in our success and for the future? And so we can stay ahead of the curve because everybody was working remotely. I've seen a ton of companies spend a lot of money on fixing issues just because they had, quote unquote, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? One admin is making a change where 3 other admins are working in a sandbox environment, and there isn't a really good strategy to deploy from one sandbox into a production or a UAT, which is a full sandbox, into the production environment. And just being able to have a formalized release plan could save those folks money. So once you are able to kind of set that expectation of why COE is important, defining what meetings should take place, you'll likely see different versions of COEs that people work with. If you're just kind of getting started, you can have what we call like a consolidated model. One project team manages all Salesforce changes. For a lot of the smaller companies, like medium-sized organizations where their needs aren't too complex, this is kind of a good model where you might have a second tier, which is a federated model, multiple project teams that are operating at the same time, managing different work streams. You've got sales, you've got marketing, finance, IT, and operations, where they'll need to combine the work from various teams into kind of a staging or a full sandbox before it goes into production. And then a confederated model where you've got multiple production instances of Salesforce that operate independently. And then larger organizations, I think one of the other panelists had mentioned where you had 15 different orgs, diverse business units that are not connected to one another. How do you start to streamline all of that together and be able to have communication that's streamlined so that those standards are maintained? You've got the best practices and everybody knows what's the protocol to implement on a regular basis. If you have a release plan that's a 2-week sprint or it's a 1-month sprint, everybody knows what those drop dead dates are, and there's alignment across the business. I think those are some of the critical building blocks, but at the end of the day, as I had mentioned before, it's never too late to kind of start. I think as small organizations are getting ready to want to scale to the enterprise level, it's being able to at least build that mission of why is a COE important, even if you think it's going to be a lot of time. You're investing your success and you're minimizing issues, before they can actually happen.
I agree with that. There definitely has to be buy-in at the top. Buy-in to Salesforce is the first one, right? When you have people who see, hey, wow, I can use that, that's a great thing. And then there's also, as you just mentioned, and with those multiple orgs, multiple business systems, I could use that too. That's another thing that I see when people start using something and then all of a sudden somebody else finds out about it and is like, wait, why am I not doing that? But the what's in it for me, especially at the high levels, start to create that vision and that adoption. And then you're really offering people the opportunity to help build the system to deliver what they're going to really want and deliver on their vision. And then, that's when we bring everyone together and say, okay, what's our combined vision? But, as you also said, what's the mission? What's the goal? What's the charter? What are we trying to do here? Which, you want to have a group to do that. You want to get some executive input on that as well. But, I completely agree. But it's really the adoption thing all over, right? This is an adoption issue. And if you inspire people about what's possible with it, they want to be part of it. It's not arm twisting. It's not about the ROI. It's about, delivering a vision that delivers the ROI.
I agree with John. As I'm looking to just start it with my small organization, and that's the approach I'm taking, having that executive sponsor, and then who are the functional leaders in each of the respective areas that are currently using Salesforce. Right now would be our admissions team, our marketing team, which also involves pre-enrollment as well as graduate alumni relations. And as other functions are looking to come into Salesforce, we'll identify those leaders. And then putting a release management schedule around it. So I think, there's particular steps that you could just start taking to put some rigor around Salesforce. Like we have a bunch of admins, right? They're all in there working and playing in the sandboxes. When's it released to production? Who has ownership of that? Are any conflicting? Are we going to release something into production that one of our implementation partners has been building in the sandbox that we just overrode? We just want to have some management behind it. And what I'm finding now is that we haven't documented a lot of things. So shameless plug to Elements. Thank you. You're helping us get there. And we're learning, and the tool is definitely allowing us to shape that model. And it's getting us an opportunity to think about, we need to start shaping this now rather than looking back and saying, oh, we got to play catch up. That's not the end of the world, right? You can make it happen, but if you can get ahead of it, get ahead of it. And I think there was a question, Ian, in the question about KPIs and COE cadence. Today we use Chatter, or in our ecosystem, we use Teams to talk about requirements that come in from the business unit to review, because we don't really have a formal process right now that we follow for Salesforce that we're going to. From a COE perspective, my idea is to meet monthly to review each of the requirements. Just because we're a small org, that I think we don't need to meet more frequently. We might in the future, but just to make sure that we're not conflicting on top of each other. I just want to make sure that question got answered. I don't have a KPI answer for that though yet.
Do we need to have a return on investment for a COE? Is it so obvious you need to have one? So like, you don't need a return on investment to say we need to do testing. Of course we need to do testing. Or do we think are people still at the case where you have to build some sort of return on investment or business case to put the stuff in place?
I think there should be ROI on everything, right? That's just my opinion. You got to justify.
I think it depends on the organization. I think in some you probably don't need to necessarily have numbers. It's my previous company, it was really just hey, let's make sure everyone has input and we're on the same page about what we're doing, and let's build for everybody, right? That was enough. That is a return on investment, that people are going to get something out of these meetings. But again, that was much less expensive meetings. My current company, I remember we had my first meeting with the executives, the IS steering committee was in Chicago, and it was probably around a $200,000 meeting to get everybody there, everybody's time, all that, and it was 2 days. So, there's definitely a little more of a need to demonstrate an ROI, or to at least express it. But again, it's the same thing. Let's make sure we're delivering on what people need. And the KPIs, that's the group that's going to determine the KPIs. You want the people who are immersed in that business unit that you're building something for, because they're the ones who can say, these are the measures that should change, and this is how they should change. So I think, you know, it's a very important case for having a center of excellence, is to get KPIs.
So I wasn't suggesting you shouldn't have an ROI for Salesforce, but is the maturity of the center of excellence to a point where people go, we should put this in place, or do you have to try and justify, we do need metadata management, we do need these things, and you're trying to convince people, and then you've got to put some numbers around it to say the cost of not doing this is X?
I think no. It's more of just, in my experience, you say this is what's needed, right? We do need change management. I do need a tool that will help me, you know, monitor changes. I do need a full sandbox, right? That's just part of how you do any sort of software development. Not so much a use case, it's just this is standard. This is industry standard across everything. These things are requirements. That's kind of how I sold it myself.
Yeah.
We were similar. We did a lot of modeling of our COE services and value offerings based upon what our legacy application development teams were, how they were built and governed and managed. So we came along after them, didn't necessarily have to prove our own ROI or justify ourselves, but it was more about maximizing the ROI on the Salesforce spend in general. And then modeling ourselves. That's kind of been how I've managed our own COE processes, looking at how all the processes and teams that are in place to manage our Java-based development and all those solutions and products, and knowing that in time, eventually IHG in total was going to start really looking at the Salesforce operation similarly, and they have in the last year or so. So we're getting a lot more scrutiny from security. We're getting a lot more scrutiny from our enterprise architecture teams. And so fortunately, we've had that in mind for the last couple of years as we built. And it really hasn't been about ROI justification for the COE itself for us.
So OJ, what about you? Because you're different because you're coming in as a consultant.
Yeah.
Are you pushing at an open door, or are you having to persuade people this is a good idea?
Yeah. Well, first off, the way that I looked at it and the way I've consulted organizations is Salesforce is a big investment, right? From a time and a money standpoint. When I used to work at Salesforce, I had helped start the Red Account program. So it was a program that we rolled out globally, working with customers that were at risk of attrition. And the first year, we found that a lot of Red Accounts were implementation adoption related. And what we found was a part of that reason was not really establishing a formal COE. The cost of having to migrate to another CRM, going through attrition and deciding on moving to a new CRM to migrate all your data, migrate all your processes, is a significant investment. And that's been a conversation that I've had with a lot of companies in the ecosystem to date, which is you're going to make this a big investment to move to Salesforce. You're going to define a new process. You're going to set the expectation that this is the application you want to grow on. It's kind of important in a consideration to make sure that you have those standards in place so that you can make sure you are getting a return. And even if that return isn't from users logging in and being able to get the analytics you have, it's the cost of having to invest in moving to something else. I think overall, when we get into working with organizations from a consulting standpoint, it's important to make sure that we capture what their requirements are, making sure we get buy-in from the users, but setting that expectation that Salesforce is like a plant that needs to water, right, and grow, right? You can't just let it sit there. Users are going to want to make changes, and your business is going to change. So Salesforce change with it, and to be able to accommodate that. And as you start to onboard new people into the organization, that is where you really have that centralized location of where to go for how things get moved into production. Where do people get collateral around? How do I use this part of the Salesforce application? Duplication of records in any CRM is killer, right? I think once users stop trusting the data, guess what? They stop using the system. And that's an important concept that we typically try to train users on when they're using Salesforce and they're trying to build out a COE, is to be able to maintain data integrity, especially if you're integrating other applications into it. The COE and the protocols you have in place are going to help to minimize what those challenges are. So to answer your question, Ian, from my perspective, and from a consulting organization's perspective, it's just as important to make sure that you have the foundation for building a center of excellence, in addition to making sure you get it right when you're designing the system and you're making sure that the business processes are in place and they're mapped to how Salesforce should work.
Okay, so that leads me to the next question, which is, so when I'm looking for this senior executive, this buy-in, is it someone in IT? Is it someone in the business? Where do I go and look?
Anyone that's interested.
Agreed.
Funding is the biggest problem. So if you got an executive sponsor that'll get behind you and help, I don't think you should be too choosy.
I think getting your CIO on board is a an important goal to have, because if they don't believe in it as the senior technology person in the company, you have a little more issues. But I think more critical is, like you said, just anybody on the business side who's interested. When we got our two top executive vice presidents both on board and excited is when everything changed. When they started seeing it and started mapping out their own visions, that turned the entire conversation. Our funding tripled.
But surely the CIO has just written a massive check to Salesforce, so should have a vested interest in this.
Well, he hadn't yet. He started writing that check afterwards, but it was for him. It was when I was able to show how we can derive value for our agents that never even touch the system. Using Customer 360 and tying in all our other systems, web activity, email stuff. When we can tie all that back, and we can feed lists to people to send stuff to, even if they never log in. Right? We don't need 100% adoption. We don't even need 80% adoption to get ROI. That was when he bought into it and started seeing the power of what we were talking about.
So Roger, different perspective from you, I guess, because you don't have, the business is defined in a slightly different way. I think you said you were off talking to a board of trustees, so that sounds like a slightly different model.
Yeah, so, well, the meeting prior to this was not with the trustees, but with our president's council. And we were introducing the idea. So, for our organization, the funding is on the technical side of the house, which has its own challenges, right? But we fall under our chief operating officer for the college. So for me, having the COO probably as the executive sponsor is key. And then having each of the functional business leaders having a seat at the table for the COE is going to be key to success in my first modeling of putting this together.
I would say that to how it was answered earlier, it's whoever is interested, because I've seen organizations where IT say, that's a business function, they're owning it, we have way too much on our plate to manage. And it's kind of the first one to say, well, even if the IT is writing the check, if it's somebody that's really excited to want to own this and drive it forward, to identify that person and build around that individual or build around that team. But I'd say overall, it's kind of a mixture between, I've seen it both managed by the business side or the IT side. I think the way that Salesforce has been positioned is, hey, it's a tool that can be managed by somebody that's non-technical. That's absolutely true. And it doesn't need a developer or an engineer to kind of manage it from an administrative standpoint. But generally speaking, when it is going to be touching different parts of the organization, you're going to get buy-in from different stakeholders. So there's got to be at least one person that's going to champion it from the top. And whoever raises their hand up to say, well, we'll go and do it, that person really should be surrounded with the support to help it scale.
But it's okay. So that again wasn't the answer I was necessarily expecting, which is fantastic. Which I think Todd summed it up, which is like anyone who's excited, grab them and just rally around that and start to build a business case. So and one of the things that we're finding is that there's not enough information around about what a center of excellence is. So we're trying to build some of that thought leadership. So when someone says, well, I now need to go and tell this person what the benefits. So we're trying to produce some of that content. And I think these sessions that we're running, over time, we're building up a whole series of really valuable assets that people can use who are sitting, listening, going, how do I get started? How can I point to someone else in the ecosystem? like that person there is in a company like us. This is how they got started. So I'm conscious we've got a few minutes left. Do you want to each one of you go just like 2 or 3 sentences on how you summarize the value of having a center of excellence, and then what your plans are next?
I'm at that point now of starting. So I'm trying to map out who those players are. My goal for the COE is shared responsibility and shared buy-in to share in the success. So I think that's my summary of it. And I'm probably all share that, where I'm trying to identify each of the key business areas and align that with IT. I'm non-technical. I differ from Todd. Like, I'm not a solution architect. I'm coming in, I surround myself with those brains to be successful, but be able to shape that model so that we can all move towards a vision and where do we want the organization to go? Because we're also in the same boat, Todd. We're trying to keep the lights on right now. So
I'll go next. So 2 of my top accounts over at All Cloud just recently finished their implementation, their first initial implementation of Salesforce. And towards UAT and our team delivering or getting ready to get the customers live, I started the process of helping to build out the release plan and started the concept of building the COE before they went live. And at least from my perspective, kind of the value drivers behind it were, well, first off, shared alignment across the executives, the different business units, so they know who is going to be participating in the COE and helping to drive it forward. But more importantly, it's expertise and knowledge share, right? I think to have a location where kind of the best practices, training materials are located, where there's design standards and governance, people know where to go for that, right? Especially for newer employees joining the organization, they know that, hey, Salesforce is in place. Where do they go to get information they need to get kind of trained on? The other is innovation, right? I think given that Salesforce provides releases multiple times a year, somebody needs to drive, or a team needs to be driving, well, here are the 10 new things that are coming. There's 10 user stories in the backlog that the users are saying are high priority. We don't need to go and write custom code, Apex or Visualforce to do it. There's something in the new release that's going to do it. That whole training process is really important, right? It goes back with the idea of change management. And the last thing I'd say in terms of driving value is KPIs, right? People want to be able to measure how many people are logging in, what's the usage of Salesforce in general, and being able to prove back to leadership that Salesforce is a big investment we've made, but look at what it's doing in terms of the big question you asked earlier is ROI. So from my perspective, you're not kind of working for just one company setting it up. It's working for multiple companies. Those are the types of conversations I'm having at the very beginning when companies are ready to start their journey on Salesforce. Again, it's just as important as getting the implementation right. It's establishing the level of maturity of your COE.
Yeah, I everything OJ said was spot on there. I'll add in that kind of the 2 things from my perspective. One is mass. The more people you have at the top of that COE helping, right, it provides mass, which gives you one momentum, but also helps keep you from getting knocked off the vision and knocked off the path. But the other piece is then kind of spreading the work. What I found when I did it at PREM Group is that, especially with training materials, the other members volunteered to have people writing training materials for the things that were specific for their teams. And then we organized those into libraries that would then share those documents with the other ones. So, person over here is responsible for maintaining and keeping this piece of material up to date, but it's tied into our knowledge articles for the trainings for all those other teams. So we kind of diversified that. And so it's not all on the Salesforce team or our knowledge team. It's everybody's kind of taking responsibility for their pieces of things. And it really made it diversify the ownership of the platform among all of us.
So I think I'll just wrap it up, I guess, on that one. I was trying to think of a sentence or some words, and I think synergy, better together. We came from an environment where we had however many Salesforce instances spun up, all being run independently and operated independently. And the whole concept of COE for us was to bring those teams together, standardize, make things more efficient, with the ultimate goal of hoping to maximize our value that from the Salesforce spend across the enterprise. So that's what we've tried to do. And I think going forward, my goals would be to continue to look for ways to make things more efficient, better tools, more tools, continue to tweak our processes as we go along. And hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, that the business funding will come along. We've just been in the keep the lights on mode, and I'm looking forward to the end of this year and next year to start creating new things and new solutions to add more value to the business.
I think that's a fantastic summary. Actually, thank you guys for the input over the last hour. As you said, it's all about driving business value for your end users, but it's making sure everything's getting aligned behind that.